Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The alley was dark and narrow, bathed in the flickering light of streetlights. Marcus Kane walked slowly, almost casually, his hands buried in the pockets of his black coat. He had learned never to show his emotions. But tonight, something was wrong. 3 men, visibly drunk and heavy-set, blocked his path. "Hey, you look like your pockets are empty," one of them said with a cruel smile. Marcus sighed. These men thought they could intimidate anyone. He had been patient, discreet, but never weak. He lowered his head slightly, assessing every movement, every breath. These criminals ignored a truth that even the criminal world feared: Marcus was no ordinary citizen. He had been one of the most wanted hitmen in the country, a man whose name, whispered in the underworld, made even the toughest tremble. But his past was behind him, or so he thought. The men laughed as they pushed him, thinking they were playing a cruel little game. Little did they know, they had just awakened the predator that had been dormant within him for years. Marcus didn't want this violence, not tonight. But he knew some lessons could only be learned through fear. And tonight, they would understand. The smiles on all 3 men vanished almost instantly when Marcus Kane decided the time for humiliation was over. The tables were turning. Marcus Kane walked through the narrow city streets, his thoughts lost in the past he had tried to bury. Since leaving the world of bloody contracts, he had led a quiet life, far from gunfights and orders to be carried out. But tonight, that tranquility would be shattered. 3 men were waiting for him at the corner of an alley. Their faces were marked by alcohol and violence, their eyes shining with defiance. "Hey you! Where do you think you're going with your coat?" one of them said contemptuously. Marcus didn't answer. He knew that provocation was the first step toward humiliation. But what they didn't know was that they had awakened an ancient predator. "Give me your wallet," ordered the second, advancing with a threatening step. Marcus sighed, and for the first time, a cold smile crossed his face. But before he could react, the 3 men burst out laughing and pushed him to the ground. They treated him with contempt, spat on him, thinking they were dealing with a mere passerby. It was utter humiliation. The passing crowd looked away, some too scared to intervene. Marcus Kane felt something boil inside him, that mixture of anger and cold calm, the one he had learned to master during his contract years. He stood up slowly, without a word. In his eyes, the glow of the past shone once more. What these men didn't know was that they had just awakened a former hitman. And Marcus had every intention of showing them that some mistakes came at a high price. After the humiliation in the alley, Marcus Kane returned to his small downtown apartment. The rain fell gently on the windows, adding an almost melancholic atmosphere, but Marcus wasn't sad. He was calculating. Every detail of tonight's encounter played over and over in his head. He plopped down on the couch, pulled out a black notebook, and began to write. 3 men, no famous names, but stupid enough to be arrogant. They had made a grave mistake, waking up the killer they thought had disappeared. He analyzed every angle. Their probable habits in the neighborhood. Their allies, if they had any. Their weak points, often the same for those who believe they are predators. Marcus Kane knew that revenge should not be rushed. Haste was the trap of amateurs. Every move had to be precise, methodical, relentless. Patience would be his weapon. He thought about how he would approach them, discreetly, by surprise, using their arrogance against them. Seeing them laugh and humiliate him would not go unpunished. He promised himself he would turn this humiliation into a lesson etched in their memory forever. A dim light illuminated the room, and Marcus, motionless, felt his old self reborn. The former hitman, the cold and calculating man, was ready to take back control. But this time, he wouldn't kill for money, he would kill for justice, his own way. That night, Marcus Kane didn't sleep. He planned, he anticipated, and above all, he waited for the exact moment when the criminals would discover that the man they had humiliated was not a mere passerby, but an unforgiving shadow. Marcus Kane knew the advantage lay with whoever struck first. The three men in the alley thought they could walk all over him without consequence, but Marcus was ready to remind them that some mistakes cost dearly. He had spent the day discreetly observing them from cafes, parking lots, and even from the shadows of alleyways. Their every move, their every habit was noted in his black notebook. He knew when they entered a bar, what time they left their shabby apartments, and who was protecting them. That evening, he chose the perfect moment. One of them, the most arrogant, was leaving the bar with a small group of accomplices. Marcus slipped behind them, invisible as a shadow. He didn't physically attack them. No, his approach was subtle, a simple reminder of their humiliation. With a precise gesture, he dropped a bag of personal belongings onto the sidewalk in front of them, making enough noise to attract their attention. The men turned around, confused. Marcus remained at a distance, motionless. "Hey! Is it you again?" one of them whispered nervously. Marcus Kane didn't answer. His icy stare was enough to strike fear into their eyes. Doubt crept into their eyes. What if this man wasn't who they thought he was? What if their arrogance had just put them face to face with a predator they couldn't understand? This first retort was only a warning, but it was effective. Fear set in, subtle but all-consuming. Marcus knew that total revenge would require more than mere scares, but this first spark would be enough to remind them that the humiliation of the alley would not go unpunished. Marcus Kane knew that fear alone wasn't enough. To truly regain control, he had to isolate them and force them to confront their own arrogance. It wasn't just about humiliation anymore, he had to make these men understand the difference between those who play and those who know how to kill. For several days, Marcus observed their routine with military precision. He noted every detail: their commute to work, the bars they frequented, their encounters with other criminals, and above all, their flaws, impatience, arrogance, and above all, their excessive confidence in their impunity. The perfect moment came on a Thursday evening. The three men had gathered in an abandoned warehouse, planning another heist. Marcus Kane followed them from a distance, invisible in the shadows, each step silent and calculated. Then came the first real confrontation. He blocked the warehouse exit with a simple rope and cables, enough to slow them down but not to harm them. They were trapped. One of them shouted, "Who's there? Show yourself." Marcus remained in the darkness, his calm, icy voice echoing through the hangar. "Do you remember the alley? Your arrogance? How you humiliated me?" The men exchanged worried glances, beginning to realize that they had never underestimated just a passerby, but a predator who never jokes. Marcus didn't harm them, not yet. But he showed he could control the situation at will. Every cable, every shadow, every movement was a lesson in patience and strategy. The criminals understood they were now under the control of someone with a past even they could not imagine. That night, Marcus Kane didn't kill. He just left a message: revenge was coming. And when it came, it would be total, relentless, and final. After their first confrontation, Marcus Kane knew that to be effective, fear had to be targeted individually. The three men had always been inseparable, but their arrogance made them vulnerable to manipulation. Marcus began by sowing discord. He sent anonymous, subtly threatening messages to each of them, clues about what the others were thinking, exaggerated secrets, rumors he knew each feared the others would discover. Paranoia quickly set in. The youngest, Brandon, grew suspicious of his own brother and the third accomplice. Their once trusting glances turned into silent accusations. The meetings they once held with arrogance now ended in arguments and suspicion. Marcus still showed no direct violence. His advantage was his patience and complete control. He knew that when a group splits, it becomes easy to manipulate each individual. Then came the first direct contact with one of them. Brandon was going out alone to a seedy bar. Marcus Kane followed him discreetly. When Brandon found himself isolated in an alley, Marcus appeared, a dark and imposing figure. "You know why I'm here," Marcus whispered. Brandon trembled, unable to speak. He realized that this time, the shadow he had humiliated in the alley was no ordinary man. He was a patient, methodical, and extremely dangerous predator. Marcus didn't do anything brutal, but he let Brandon know that every move would be watched, every mistake paid for. Marcus Kane's fear was becoming personal, intimate, and destructive. That night, Marcus left Brandon trembling alone in the alley. Disunity was brewing, and soon he would be able to strike each of them down, separately, until their arrogance was gone for good. Marcus Kane knew that to completely destroy these men, it wasn't enough to intimidate them physically, he had to attack their minds, their certainties, their security. Fear was most effective when it was subtle and constant. He started with Brandon, the youngest. Marcus left clues everywhere, a scribbled note slipped under his apartment door, a simple message on his phone with no visible number, signs that someone was watching him from the shadows. Brandon began to lose confidence in himself, to doubt his friends, and to wonder if he could ever be safe. Then came Jake, the most arrogant of the three. Marcus managed to infiltrate Jake's circle of friends, sowing rumors he knew Jake feared, that his partners were betraying him, that his girlfriend wasn't faithful. Each rumor was verified and justified with small theatrics, believable enough to make Jake lose his footing. The third, Derek, was the most violent, but also the most stupid. Marcus exploited his tendency to anger, small symbolic attacks, moving objects, anonymous warnings. Derek began to act irrationally, attacking his friends and endangering himself. Marcus Kane never showed his face. From the shadows, he orchestrated a precise, silent, but relentless plan. Each man was now a prisoner of his own fear, his paranoia, his guilt. Revenge didn't yet require blood. The psychological destruction was already underway. And in a few days, Marcus would strike where fear becomes real, in their very lives, confronting them with the power of a man they had believed weak, but who was in reality a predator who never forgives. Marcus Kane knew the psychological phase had paid off. The three men were now vulnerable, divided, and paranoid. It was time for the next step, direct action. He chose Derek as his first guinea pig. Derek, the most violent but also the most reckless, was leaving alone from an abandoned warehouse where he believed no one was watching him. Marcus slipped silently behind him, his shadow like that of a ghost. "You thought you could get away with it?" Marcus whispered into the darkness. Derek jumped in panic and tried to defend himself, but Marcus Kane didn't want excessive violence. A simple check, a display of mastery, was enough to remind him of the power of the man they had humiliated. Within minutes, Derek was on the ground, shaking but physically unharmed. Marcus Kane released him with a chilling warning. "You're playing with forces you don't understand. And next time, you won't be so lucky." Meanwhile, Brandon and Jake, watching from afar, were beginning to realize that the humiliated man in the alley was now the master of their destiny. Fear became tangible, immediate. Marcus knew every move had to be calculated. He didn't want to rush things. Every step of his revenge had to teach a lesson, leave a scar on the minds of these men, so that they would never dare underestimate someone like him again. That night, Marcus Kane disappeared into the shadows as silently as he had appeared, leaving behind a clear message: the revenge had begun. And it was only just beginning. After the confrontation with Derek, Marcus Kane knew the stage was set for the other two. Brandon and Jake were now paralyzed by fear and mistrust. The slightest move could cost them dearly. Marcus started with Brandon. He knew Brandon feared other people's opinions, his reputation, and his friends. One night, as Brandon walked home, Marcus dropped anonymous envelopes on his path, containing photos and clues suggesting his friends were plotting against him. Paranoia set in immediately. Brandon began avoiding public places, refusing to see anyone. Every sound in the night became a threat. Then came Jake, more arrogant but more fragile than he appeared. Marcus Kane knew how to exploit his anger. Misplaced objects, mysterious messages, and signs of invisible surveillance were enough to make him nervous. Jake began to isolate himself, convinced that someone was constantly stalking him. Marcus watched from the shadows, calculating every reaction, every weakness. He never gave them a break. Every movement, every decision the men made was now dictated by fear. The humiliation of the initial alley was now a trivial memory compared to what they were experiencing now. Within weeks, the three men were completely isolated. They no longer trusted each other, each feared the other, and each knew they were never safe. Marcus Kane had transformed their arrogance into terror, their unity into chaos. Revenge was no longer merely psychological, it had reached a level where the slightest mistake could cost them their freedom, their safety, even their lives. And Marcus Kane was ready to strike the final blow, the one that would break them forever. Marcus Kane knew the decisive moment had arrived. After weeks of manipulation, fear, and dislocation, the three men were vulnerable and disunited. Revenge now had to be total, visible, but controlled. He lured the three of them into an abandoned warehouse, each believing they were about to meet an accomplice or gain some advantage. When they entered, the light was dim, shadows stretched across the walls, creating an atmosphere of absolute tension. "Did you really think I would remain passive?" Marcus said, his icy voice echoing in the vast, empty space. The three men froze. Fear was palpable. They knew, deep down, that the man they had humiliated in the alley was no longer who they thought he was. Marcus Kane moved slowly, methodically, controlling the scene like a chess master. Every gesture, every look, every word was calculated to maximize their fear. "You thought you could humiliate me without consequence. You laughed at me, but that laughter is over," he said, stopping in front of Derek, the most violent, who was still trembling. Then he turned to Brandon and Jake. Neither moved. Marcus let a heavy silence fall, making them feel the weight of every past humiliation and every present fear. "Tonight you will understand the difference between a man who is despised and a man who is underestimated. He didn't harm them, not physically. But he transformed the space into a mental trap. Every sound, every shadow, every word he spoke was a lesson in control and fear." By the end of that confrontation, the three men were no longer the same, psychologically broken, erased of their arrogance, aware that Marcus Kane was a predator from whom they would never emerge unscathed. When he disappeared into the darkness, he left behind a single truth: the man they had humiliated was not just a former hitman, he was a shadow no one could ignore, and whose vengeance never fails. After the final judgment, Marcus Kane retreated into the shadows, leaving behind the broken and terrified men. They were mere shadows of their former selves, unable to regain their arrogance or find themselves again. Revenge had been wrought, cold, methodical, and complete. But Marcus didn't want to live in fear or bloodshed. His goal was never wanton destruction, he wanted to restore his own balance, to close this chapter of his life. He returned to his apartment, cleaned his weapons and notes, and for the first time in years, took a deep breath. The city continued to turn, unaware of the shadow that had walked among it and the lesson it had just taught. Marcus Kane stepped out into the night, walking alone through the damp streets, free. The former hitman had resumed his life, but with a newfound certainty: the underestimated man never dies in the shadows, he survives, he learns, and he strikes when the time comes. In the stillness of the night, Marcus smiled slightly. He knew he would never be weak again. The criminals he had humiliated were a lesson to anyone who would dare challenge or despise the wrong person. And so, the shadow that had been humiliated in an alleyway had become master of its destiny once again, ready to live by its own rules, while keeping in mind one immutable truth: some men only reveal themselves once, and that revelation always leaves an indelible mark.